Hello and welcome to History Between the Lines. Today we'll be talking about the systematic use of torture by French forces during their counterinsurgency in Algeria, conducted during the 1950s and 1960s against Algerian independence fighters. This is quite a morbid topic, but I think also a very important one, as the use of torture on suspected insurgents became such an integral part of the French counterinsurgency, and it also showed how post-Second World War the atmosphere and perceptions surrounding insurgencies and counterinsurgencies had changed markedly. Finally, the use of torture in this way by military and security forces obviously hasn't gone away. Therefore, the legacy of this system of torture is still very much with us. So, to go back a little in time, there had always been resistance to French colonial rule in Algeria since it had been conquered during the 1830s. But before the First World War, this resistance had mainly been tribal in nature and occurred in the countryside, and had been dealt with more or less effectively by the French military. But the Great War marked a shift in this resistance as urban resistance also emerged, caused by an Islamic revival, the Salafiyya movement that urged a return to doctrinal purity. Algerian resistance against the French was transformed even more by the Second World War. The defeat of France itself in June 1940 during the war, and its subsequent occupation by the Germans for a number of years, had burst the bubble of French imperial invincibility, and this strengthened the Algerian independence movement. Moreover, a new, younger, more radical generation of Algerian independence fighters was beginning to emerge post-1945. These militants became strongly committed to fight against the French and drive them out by force whatever the cost, and crucially, this resistance was now ideologically motivated. The liberation of France from German occupation in 1944 had also led many Algerians to ask why they could not also be free. The growing poverty of many Algerians who had fled to the country's coastal cities in search of jobs which didn't exist further strengthened this new militant stance. This was further compounded by the fact that after the war ended, the French failed to come to any agreements with Algerian moderates and only drew more and more people towards the radicals. Furthermore, the Algerian independence movements, previously divided amongst themselves, were strengthened by the fact that by the 1950s almost all of them had been united under the leadership of the Front de la Libération Nationale, or the FLN. Also, very importantly, these Algerian insurgents were now living post-1945 in an official anti-colonial atmosphere. This is because the idea was present that if the Allies had fought and beaten Germany, Italy and Japan during the war for the cause of freedom, then why should colonial peoples, including Algerians, not also be given their freedom and the right to self-determination? The post-war world also had the United Nations, where the FLN could voice its grievances internationally and receive sympathy and diplomatic support from other nations such as China and the Soviet Union, who then also placed pressure on the French to deal with the rebels and the FLN specifically, which meant they could not negotiate with another group which might have accepted a resolution short of independence. Moreover, the very perception of an insurgency had changed by the end of the Second World War. This was because, with the Allies having encouraged, supported and supplied insurgencies themselves to fight against German and Japanese occupiers during the war, including in France during the occupation, the image of the insurgent was transformed. Now, post-war, they were seen more sympathetically by more people as freedom fighters on the side of right and justice. The colonial counterinsurgency set up to crush these irregular fighters was, in contrast, now seen as repressive, violent, immoral, and going against everything the Allies had fought for during the war. Such a perception was unthinkable before the Second World War, with the vast majority of people in the United States and Europe Europe, seeing insurgents as nothing more than bandits, and the counterinsurgency as a brave and completely acceptable way to pacify an unruly colonial region. To put it another way, post-1945, the roles of heroes and villains in irregular warfare had been switched. So, in short, post-war, the French administrators in Algeria were now confronted with a united, ideologically motivated, more radicalised Algerian insurgent independence movement, with the cause of anti-colonialism now very strong internationally. After the war, however, there was an almost unanimous determination amongst the French to maintain Algeria as a part of France through the use of military force if need be. There were a number of reasons for this. Firstly, in this post-war world, France felt that it had to retain its colonial empire in order to remain a global power and restore its prestige after their defeat during the Second World War. This defeat even convinced many people that the empire had to be kept, as it was the colonies that had aided Charles de Gaulle and the anti-Nazi Free French movement and had saved France itself from the collaborationist Vichy regime. There was a shared anguish across virtually the entire French political spectrum at France losing its national greatness and being humiliated after a number of defeats. Therefore, there was a nationalistic determination for France to retain its independence in a hostile post-war world. All of these feelings led to the conviction that the colonies would remain French, which it was also believed would also spiritually regenerate France and the French people. Within this widely held view, Algeria was especially important. Indeed, Algeria itself was seen as different from all other French colonies. This is because it was seen as part of France itself. It was more than a colony, it was a section of the metropole, highlighted by the fact that it was governed by the Ministry of the Interior rather than the Ministry of Colonies. This increased its importance in the eyes of many French people and strengthened the determination to retain it, even as other French colonies fell away during the 1950s, such as Indochina. This view was present because Algeria had a strong settler presence within it, with around 11% of Algeria's population in 1950 being made up of the descendants of French settlers known as Pieds Noirs. The majority of these settlers could not bring themselves to accept the legitimacy of Algerian independence. They saw Algeria as their own and believed it to be a new French society they and their ancestors over 100 years before had built on the other side of the Mediterranean Sea. The close proximity of France to Algeria also reinforced this idea that they were the same country, with only a leisurely boat trip separating France from the Algerian coastline, which further made the idea of Algerian independence seem absurd to many French people. Pieds Noirs also saw Algeria as a frontier society, effectively France's equivalent of the American West, a frontier of vast swathes of land full of hope, opportunity, and crucially a land they deserved to control. They saw Algeria as a French creation and an indissoluble part of France, therefore it was to be defended, and all of the French governments during the 1950s insisted that Algeria was part of France and ignored the fact that dividing it into departments and offering citizenship under conditions unacceptable to the vast majority of the population had not made Algeria French in the eyes of most Muslims. As Pierre Mendès France, the then French Prime Minister, stated to the National Assembly in November 1954, and I quote, "One does not compromise when it comes to defending the internal peace of the nation, the unity and integrity of the Republic. The Algerian departments are part of the French Republic. They have been French for a long time and they are irrevocably French. Between them and metropolitan France, there can be no conceivable secession," unquote. The The Fourth Republic also wished to retain Algeria for more practical reasons, notably the belief that imperial possessions like Algeria were required to rebuild the French economy post-war. The French military was also particularly determined to retain Algeria for a number of reasons. Notably, the French armed forces wanted to crush the independence insurgency in Algeria in order to restore their reputation. A string of defeats, notably the collapse of France in 1940 and then post-war the loss of Indochina in 1954 and the failure of the Suez Canal operation in 1956, led to much bitterness amongst French soldiers and a desire to wipe the slate clean and restore their honour and prestige with military victory in Algeria. Such a perception had also led many French soldiers to believe that time and again their spineless civil government in Paris had betrayed them and withdrawn from conflicts like Indochina before the French military could have won. French troops were determined that they would not let Paris do the same thing when it came to Algeria. Such a belief within the army soon poisoned French civil-military relations. Older French officers also still supported the civilizing empire perception of France's previous colonial commanders under whom they had served. Several officers had also fought in the resistance in North Africa during the Second World War, therefore it was inconceivable to them that this land should now be given up. So, with such polarised views on both sides, war was bound to break out. Now, acts of resistance by the new militant generation of Algerian nationalists had started as soon as the Second World War ended, but the fully fledged Algerian insurgency was not launched until November 1954. That month, the FLN launched 30 attacks simultaneously on police stations and other official buildings in Algeria, and Cairo Radio announced the FLN's intention to fight for independence. Fires were set, bombs exploded in Algiers, the capital city, and French people and Algerians who sympathised with the French regime were targeted and killed. The French government responded by sending in troops to crush the insurgency and any move towards independence. The Algerian War had started. The conflict in Algeria initially proved difficult for the French. The army struggled to defeat the insurgents, who were organised into small cells that struck quickly and then disappeared. Attempts to provide protection from the FLN and maintain control often failed, and France was forced to use conscripts from metropolitan France in order to continue the war, and there were nearly 400,000 French troops in Algeria by 1956. Later that same year, Algiers was subjected to terror campaigns by both sides, and bombs exploded all over the city, killing and injuring dozens of people. This was the cycle of violence, a concept elaborated by the 19th century military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, which is often present in irregular warfare. Effectively, the cycle of violence is one of the main advantages an insurgency has over a counterinsurgency, with the latter usually possessing more firepower and greater resources and numbers of troops. However, if insurgents increase the level of violence used in the conflict and commit a number of atrocities, this will lead to those personnel conducting the counterinsurgency to also increasing their levels of violence, either out of retaliation or the belief that the counterinsurgency has to be as ruthless and brutal as the insurgency if it is to have any hope of winning. And then this cycle just continues as the war goes on, with the levels of violence getting higher and higher. This puts insurgents at an advantage as it allows them to retain the initiative, and the ever-increasing brutality of the counterinsurgency has the effect of driving any uncommitted civilians into the arms of the insurgents. Therefore, the insurgency's strength and its chances of victory increase. This is exactly what happened in Algeria, and one of the main manifestations of this cycle of violence here was the eventual French adoption of the use of torture as a main counterinsurgency tactic. Torture in and of itself was nothing new to irregular warfare. However, the cycle of violence which I've just talked about and the particular circumstances of the Algerian War, notably the FLN structure, meant that the use of torture became a systematic method used by the French military when they interrogated captured suspected Algerian insurgents. This was because the FLN operated in cells of 3 men, only one of whom knew a superior or inferior in another cell. If a member of a cell was captured, he was to say nothing for 24 hours, giving the others time to hide. Therefore, to break and destroy the FLN, the French military argued, obtaining information was the key element in this irregular war, and such information had to be obtained quickly, and that meant using torture to get answers out of people. French soldiers also turned to systematic torture as a way to show their toughness and prove to people that they were still effective, unyielding soldiers and that they could win after a series of defeats. In March 1956, Prime Minister Guy Mollet sent a government proposal supported by the National Assembly to set aside individual freedoms in Algeria and to permit French soldiers and the police to use extended questioning, coercive measures, or special treatment on detainees. These terms were later revealed to be euphemisms for giving the military a free hand to do anything considered necessary. The rules of French law and the Geneva Convention were soon widely ignored as abuse and torture was carried out on a large scale, and soon it was used not just to get information out of people, but also as a method of intimidation, punishment, or a way for policemen and soldiers to vent their anger created by the fact that they were fighting an invisible enemy. The French used a number of methods of torture. One of them was electric shock, with the electrodes usually applied to the victim's genitals. This method was commonly used as it allowed for increasing levels of pain and because it distanced the interrogators, with them merely having to push a button rather than inflict pain directly. Other methods included waterboarding and cruder forms of torture, such as stripping victims naked, beatings combined with hanging them by their feet or hands, and rape. This torture tactic did work for the French military, and they did get information out of captured suspects quickly, and by October 1957 they had dismantled the FLN's core network of around 2,000 insurgents. However, this was only a short-term victory, as the FLN regrouped in the rural areas and still ultimately triumphed, and as with many instances of a manifestation of the cycle of violence, this widespread torture ultimately drove more Algerians to support the FLN. And just as importantly, the use of torture came to public attention in France, and the effects of this showed that the use of torture in a counterinsurgency was no longer acceptable in this post-1945 climate, and showed that a counterinsurgency required moral and political strength as well as effective military methods to win. There had been rumours of the French forces using torture systematically throughout the mid to late 1950s, but it was only in February 1958 that the French public became fully aware of the extent to which torture had become a central feature of the war effort. At that time, a journalist named Henri Allège, a member of the Algerian Communist Party, published a damning account of his own arrest and torture at the hands of the French military, entitled La Question. L'Édition des Minutes, a publishing house created during the German occupation to publish French resistance texts, published Allège's account, which he smuggled out of prison. Although the French government tried many things to have it banned, copies of the account were soon circulating in large numbers. Allège's graphic descriptions shocked the French public, and anti-war sentiment in the metropole grew in the wake of Allège's revelations. Allège's account and several others like it gave the moral victory to the FLN, and the French Republic was now seen as morally bankrupt, and the use of torture was seen as one of the manifestations of the perceived gangrenal rot which was seeping into the Fourth Republic and undermining it. Another criticism of the use of torture was linked to specifically French characteristics, as it was argued that the use of torture violated France's republican principles, especially justice, the rule of law, and the rights of man, and this further ebbed support for the Algerian War. Giving such a political, moral and public relations victory to the Algerian insurgency was now very significant in this post-war world. The international atmosphere surrounding irregular warfare had changed dramatically, but the French government was oblivious to this shift. French soldiers in particular didn't realise that torture was not so widely accepted in colonial conflicts anymore. Before the Second World War, when, as I said, insurgents were overwhelmingly seen by the people of the metropole as primitive bandits, torturing them was seen as a perfectly acceptable method to crush the rebellion. Post-1945, although some people still held this view, the majority of people, because of the increased sympathy for insurgents and the right of colonial peoples to gain their freedom as a result of the Second World War, which I spoke about earlier, now saw torturing suspected irregular fighters as immoral. The French military also failed to grasp the fact that freedom of speech and improved 1950s communications, notably television and radio, allowed news of the torture to reach a wider audience and therefore have a larger impact on views, perceptions and, crucially, public support for the conflict, both within France and internationally. So, this system of torture was not the only reason why France lost the conflict in Algeria, but it was still a large element in undermining public support for the war. Therefore, the use of torture highlights how counterinsurgencies had changed by the 1950s, with public support and moral legitimacy for the counterinsurgency now being more influential than military triumphs, as torture did work in part in Algeria, but its political and moral costs within the civilian metropole and internationally were too high and contributed to the French government eventually deciding to withdraw from Algeria and not gaining ultimate victory. The French military's use of torture in Algeria was also very important, as its legacy is still very much with us. Arguably, the effects that the use of torture created for the French forces almost repeated itself for the Western coalition during the counterinsurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan during the early 21st century, when the use of torture, notably waterboarding, again shocked metropolitan publics and arguably contributed to the coalition forces losing public support and moral legitimacy. Therefore, it is certainly a counterinsurgency issue that is yet to be resolved. The Algerian War would drag on for several more years, and it eventually destroyed the French Fourth Republic and plunged the metropole into crisis until Algeria eventually became independent during the early 1960s. There is still so much to talk about in regards to this conflict, and I may do a longer and more comprehensive episode in the future about this war, as it's such an interesting and significant part of 20th century history. So, thank you for listening to this episode of History Between the Lines. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.